making sprouted sourdough rice bread, gluten-free bread. So we're going to start with your sprouted rice. I have 4 cups of sprouted rice. Just put it into the food processor. And we're going to grind it into flour. And if you have a flour mill dedicated gluten-free, you can use that instead. But I don't, so I'm going to use a food processor. So just turn it on and let it go. Alright, so we've finished the first step of grinding the rice, and it should have a coarse, almost like coarse ground cornmeal texture to it. And it's not going to get much finer unless we add some liquid, just the way it works in this food processor. So before I add the liquid, I'm going to add about a teaspoon of, this is unrefined Celtic sea salt. And then I'm going to add some sourdough starter. And this sourdough starter is made also from sprouted rice. We just sprouted the rice, we ground it into a flour, added some water, and then let it sit out on the counter until it had soured naturally from the wild yeast in the air. So I'm going to take about a 1/4 cup of sourdough starter and add that. And then process that, and that liquid will help it grind a little bit finer. Okay, so the texture is a lot thicker now, like a dough. And I'm going to add some more liquid. I'm going to add 3 eggs to help it grind even finer still, because it's still kind of a coarse flour in there. I'm going to do it 1 egg at a time though, just so that it really has a lot of time to process and grind that grain down. Alright, be sure that you scrape the sides down, otherwise you get clumps going. And I'm going to go ahead and add another egg. And you can see the texture is getting thicker. It's kind of like a really stiff muffin batter right now. So we're going to go ahead and blend after each egg. Alright, and then the texture is getting much better. It's like a really thick pancake batter. We're going to add the final egg and just mix it in. So here is the texture of the batter. It's much runnier now, and you can't really see any big chunks of grain. It's all pretty well incorporated. Final step for plain sprouted sourdough gluten-free rice bread is to add the cream. Now at this point, if you want to just have the plain bread, you'll add the cream and then that's it, you're done. But I'm going to actually turn this into cinnamon raisin bread. So I have a teaspoon of cinnamon and then about 1/8 of a teaspoon to a 1/4 teaspoon of allspice. So I'm going to add that. And then I have about 1/2 or 1/3 of a cup of raisins, and the amount doesn't matter on the raisins, just however much you want. More is sweeter. And you can also use chopped up dates if you prefer. So I'm just going to mix that in. Not too much or it will pulverize the raisins, and I want to be able to still have chunks of raisins in there. So you can give a stir and see if it looks like the right amount of raisins. If you like that, that's good. Otherwise you can add more. And then the final ingredient is cultured cream and I use grass-fed Jersey cream, and we culture it ourselves. You could also substitute sour cream, and I add about 1/4 cup. You could add more, between 1/4 and 1/3 of a cup of cultured cream, and that's just to get some fat in there. If you don't have cream, if you prefer using butter, you can use 4 or 5 tablespoons of butter instead. And you don't want to over-process this because I don't want to damage the fats by over-processing it in the food processor. So if you want, you could just stir in the cream by hand, or if you're using butter, you would want to cut that in and make sure it's well incorporated, but don't over-mix it. So just a little mix there, and then I'm going to pour it into a regular bread pan that's been buttered. You could also use olive oil or tallow or lard, whatever fat you want, something stable. It's not going to oxidize with heat. So at this point I have one that I already poured into a pan, and I like to cover it with saran wrap just to keep the dust off or bugs or anything like that. And then what I do is I take a Sharpie marker, this is just saran wrap, and I mark on the pan the level of the batter when I first pour it in. And then I'm going to set this in a warm place. I like to use the upper shelf of a bookshelf that's near a fireplace. It's nice and warm. And I set it on the shelf, and then as it rises I can tell how far it's risen. When it's risen towards the top of the pan, so when it's about here, maybe 1/4 of an inch below the top of the pan, then that's good enough. I'm going to take the saran wrap off and I'll put it in the oven, and I'll bake it at 350 for an hour. And then after that hour, I pull it out of the oven and I let it cool. And I set the bread pan on its side while the bread cools, just so the loaf doesn't fall. And then after that, it's good to go. You can eat it. Make sure that you freeze the loaf. Once it's done, I slice it and I freeze it right away. Otherwise, it does tend to go stale. It could also get moldy. It just stays fresh best if you freeze it. So that is our sprouted sourdough gluten-free bread.